A father's heart broke as his adopted son and daughter-in-law would take him to a nursing home. What happened next left him speechless. Antonio Morales sat silently in the small, sparsely furnished room that had become his world. Once vibrant with the laughter and toys of his grandson, it now echoed with a quiet stillness that matched his spirit. At 78, he had lived through years of love, labor, and loss. But this chapter, alone in his son Alex's home in Southern California, was unlike any other. It was not the life he had imagined, and every day the weight of it pressed heavier on his heart. The mornings stretched endlessly. Antonio often sat by the single window, watching the neighborhood stir to life. Cars sped off to work. Children hurried to school. His own son and daughter-in-law, Alex and Jenny, left early and returned late, consumed by their jobs. Antonio understood they had responsibilities, a life to manage. But understanding did not fill the silence or ease the ache of being left behind. The afternoons brought Geogra, their neighbor, who arrived with warm meals and a few kind words. "How are you today, Antonio?" she'd ask brightly, setting a plate on the table. He always smiled politely, giving a standard reply. But the truth was that her brief visits only highlighted the loneliness that followed when she left. At night, as the house quieted, memories from Texas flooded his mind. There, decades ago, his life was rich with laughter. His wife's voice echoed in his mind, Sophia's soft laugh when he teased her about her cooking, the warmth of her touch when she handed him fresh bread from their kitchen. She had been his anchor, his reason for planting roses in the garden, for rising with the sun to tend to their modest farm. And there was Palomo, the sturdy horse who had shared countless hours by his side as they worked the fields. Those were days filled with love. Antonio's presence in Alex's home was never questioned, but he could feel its strain. The room he occupied had once been his grandson's, and though Alex and Jenny insisted they were glad to have him, Antonio sensed otherwise. He heard the muffled arguments late at night, caught the glances exchanged over dinner. They weren't cruel, but they were busy, distracted, and tired. He didn't blame them. He blamed himself. He was an old man taking up space in a life that no longer had room for him. One evening, after finishing a quiet meal alone, Antonio made up his mind. He had rehearsed the words 100 times in his head, but saying them aloud was harder. Still, he approached Alex, who was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, and cleared his throat. "Alex," Antonio began, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." Alex looked up, surprised. "What's wrong, Pop?" Antonio hesitated, gripping the back of a chair for support. "I've been thinking, it's time for me to move, to a place where I won't be a burden." Alex's brows furrowed. "A burden? What are you talking about?" "A nursing home," Antonio said simply. The words hung in the air like a weight. "It's better for everyone." For a moment, Alex didn't respond. Then his expression hardened. "No, absolutely not," he said firmly. "We're not doing that." "Alex," Antonio started again, trying to keep his tone calm, "I've thought about this. It's the right thing." "The right thing for who?" Alex snapped, standing now. "You think I'd let my father go to some place like that? What would people say? That I abandoned you? That I couldn't take care of you?" Antonio shook his head. "It's not about what people think, Alex. It's about what's best for you, for Jenny, for—" Alex cut him off. "Stop. This isn't happening. We'll figure something out. But you're not going to a nursing home." Antonio felt a pang of hurt. It wasn't just the rejection of his request. It was the way Alex dismissed his reasoning, as if his feelings didn't matter. Antonio had spent a lifetime putting others first, but now, when he was finally asking for something, his voice seemed small and insignificant. The conversation ended there. Alex muttered something about a long day and walked away, leaving Antonio standing in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of rejection settling on his chest. He returned to his room, sitting heavily on the edge of his bed. His hands shook as he picked up a worn photograph of Sophia. Her smile, frozen in time, seemed almost comforting. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the photo. "I didn't mean to be this way. I thought I was doing the right thing." That night, Antonio didn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring out into the quiet street, wondering if there was a place in the world where he truly belonged. Antonio Morales closed his eyes and leaned back in the worn chair by the window, letting his thoughts drift to Texas. He could almost smell the earthy scent of the fields after a spring rain and hear the soft rustling of trees that lined their small property. It was all so clear, as if he could reach out and touch the wooden walls of the house where he and Sophia had built their lives. Their home had been modest, but filled with love. Every corner told a story. Every creak in the floorboards carried a memory. Sophia had brought life to the house in a way Antonio could never quite replicate. She filled the rooms with warmth, her laughter, her cooking, the way she hummed old tunes while tending to her flowers in the garden. Alex, though not their son by blood, had been the heartbeat of their family. Antonio still remembered the day the boy first called him Dad. It was as if something in him shifted, a piece of his soul expanding to make room for a bond that would outlast everything else. Life had been simple but happy. Antonio worked the land with his horse, Palomo, while Alex played in the yard, pretending to be a cowboy. Evenings were spent around the dinner table, Sophia's voice leading their conversations, her presence anchoring them in ways Antonio didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. And then, in a single night, it all burned to ash. It had been an ordinary evening. Antonio had lit a candle when the power went out, a small effort to fight the darkness. He had been so tired from working the fields that day, he'd fallen asleep on the couch, the comforting hum of crickets lulling him into slumber. He woke to chaos, the acrid smell of smoke, the heat pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. Flames licked at the walls, devouring everything in their path. Neighbors had dragged him to safety, their shouts barely audible over the roaring fire. But when it was over, there was nothing left. The wooden beams, the photographs, the heirlooms Sophia had cherished, all of it reduced to soot and rubble. Even Palomo had bolted in fear, disappearing into the night. Antonio spent weeks in the hospital recovering, his body healing faster than his spirit. When he finally returned to the blackened remains of his home, the weight of the loss was almost unbearable. Alex had been the one to convince him to leave Texas. "Dad, there's nothing here anymore," he had said gently. "Come to California. Jenny and I will take care of you." Antonio hadn't needed much convincing. What was there to stay for? The land was nothing but scorched earth, and Sophia was gone. Alex and Jenny were his only family now. He remembered signing the papers to sell the property. Alex had assured him it was the best option. Antonio hadn't questioned it. What use was land he would never return to? In his mind, it was all going to Alex eventually. He trusted his son implicitly, even if the act of letting go felt like cutting away a piece of himself. California was different in every way. The climate, the people, the pace of life, it was all foreign to Antonio. Alex and Jenny did their best, but their lives were busy, full of responsibilities he couldn't begin to understand. They had jobs, commitments, schedules packed so tightly there was little room for the old man sitting quietly in the corner of their world. Antonio tried not to resent it. He knew they cared for him in their way. But care wasn't the same as connection. The house in California, though comfortable, never felt like home. Its sleek design lacked the warmth of the one Sophia had nurtured. There were no scuffs on the floors from Alex's childhood adventures, no faint scent of her favorite lavender candles lingering in the air. Antonio spent hours sitting by the window, watching strangers pass by on the street, his mind returning to the charred remains of what he had lost. Alex, for all his good intentions, carried a quiet guilt. He would check on Antonio between meetings, ask if he needed anything, but there was always a distance in his eyes, a discomfort he couldn't quite hide. Jenny was kind, but her attention was fleeting, her life too full to spare more than a moment here and there. Antonio didn't blame them, but he couldn't deny the ache it left behind. The memories of Texas became his refuge, the one place where Sophia still laughed, where the house still stood proud, where he and Alex had shared simpler, happier days. But those memories also became a weight, dragging him further into himself. He didn't share his thoughts, didn't voice his pain. What was the point? The past was gone, and the present had no place for an old man clinging to ashes. Antonio sat in his room, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. On the small table beside him lay a slice of store-bought cake, left earlier by Geogra. She had smiled kindly, as always, wishing him a happy birthday before hurrying off. Now the cake sat untouched, its frosting slightly melted. Antonio glanced at the clock on the wall. Nearly 9 p.m. Alex and Jenny still weren't home. No call, no mention of his birthday that morning, only the usual hurried goodbyes. He turned to the framed photograph of Sophia perched on his nightstand. Her smile was as bright and warm as the day he first met her, a contrast to the cold silence of the house. He felt the weight of it all, the loneliness, the guilt, the way his presence seemed to shrink the space around him. That evening, Alex came home late, the sound of the front door clicking shut, breaking the stillness. Antonio heard his footsteps in the hall, steady and unhurried, as if the day had been just another routine grind. Mustering his resolve, Antonio stood and walked into the living room, his hands trembling slightly. "Alex," he called out, his tone firmer than usual. Alex stopped mid-step, startled by the urgency in his father's voice. "Pop, what's wrong?" Antonio took a deep breath, his chest tight. "We need to talk. Now." Alex sighed, setting down his bag and loosening his tie. "All right. What's on your mind?" "I can't stay here anymore," Antonio said, his words deliberate and steady. "I've thought about it long enough. I need to move to a nursing home." For a moment, Alex just stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. "We've talked about this, Pop. You're not going anywhere." "No, Alex," Antonio said, his voice rising. "This isn't a suggestion. I've made up my mind. I don't want to be a weight on you and Jenny anymore." Alex groaned, rubbing his temples. "You're not a burden, Pop." "Why do you keep saying that?" Antonio's frustration boiled over. "Because that's how I feel," he exclaimed. "Every day I see how hard you both work, how little time you have. I see the strain, even if you don't say it." Alex shook his head again, more firmly this time. "We're fine. You don't have to do this. End of discussion." "No, Alex," Antonio countered, his voice shaking with emotion. "This is not about you. This is about me, my life. I deserve to have some peace, to not feel like I'm in the way all the time." Alex didn't respond, his lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment, he simply muttered, "We'll talk later," and left the room. Antonio stood there, his chest heaving, his resolve solidifying. If Alex wouldn't listen, he would take matters into his own hands. The following days passed in a haze of quiet tension. Alex avoided the topic altogether, but Antonio couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of urgency within him. Each evening he returned to his room and carefully packed away his belongings. His clothes, a few cherished keepsakes, and, of course, Sophia's photograph, all neatly arranged in his old leather suitcase. Jenny began to notice the change in him. Antonio, usually polite but talkative with her, had grown quieter, his smiles fewer and far between. One evening, as she prepared dinner, she brought it up to Alex. "I think your dad's not doing well," she said, her voice cautious. "He's quieter than usual. Sad, even." Alex frowned, but didn't look up from the papers he was reviewing. "He's fine," he replied. Jenny set down the spatula and turned to face him fully. "No, Alex, he's not. I think he's serious about leaving. Have you even talked to him?" Alex sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I told him we'd talk later. He just needs time to cool off." "Time to cool off?" Jenny repeated, her tone incredulous. "Alex, he's your father. You need to take him seriously. Whatever he's feeling, it's real to him." Alex hesitated, guilt flickering in his eyes. "We're working on something," he admitted finally. "Something that'll change all this. But I can't tell him yet." Jenny softened, her curiosity piqued. "What are you planning?" "You'll see," Alex said, a small, almost reluctant smile tugging at his lips. "But it has to stay a surprise. For now." Jenny nodded, though her worry lingered. Unaware of their plans, Antonio made his own arrangements. He spent hours calling nursing homes, painstakingly inquiring about their facilities and costs. But each conversation left him more discouraged than the last. Some places were too far, others too impersonal, and the best ones cost far more than he could afford. One afternoon, he sat in his room, staring at the list of numbers he had compiled. His suitcase sat by the door, packed and ready. For all his resolve, Antonio realized he didn't know where to go, and the thought of staying, of continuing to live in this quiet shadow of a life, was almost too much to bear. He turned to Sophia's photograph, her eyes as kind and reassuring as ever. "I'll figure it out," he whispered, though the words rang hollow. Deep down, he wasn't sure he believed them. The morning light filtered through the blinds as Antonio sat on the edge of his bed, his hands resting on his knees. There was a knock at the door, and Alex stepped in, followed by Jenny. Both were smiling, their energy oddly cheerful for a weekday morning. "Pop," Alex began, his voice warm but with an edge of excitement. "We've been thinking it's time for a little getaway." Antonio raised an eyebrow. "A getaway?" "Yeah," Jenny chimed in, holding up a neatly folded stack of fresh towels. "You need a break. We all do. So, we've planned a trip. Something special, just for you." Antonio studied their faces, trying to discern the truth beneath their words. Special, they said. A trip just for him. It didn't make sense. He wasn't one for surprises, and they knew that. His mind immediately went to the conversation they'd had weeks before. The one about the nursing home. Could this be it? A way to soften the blow, to ease him into the inevitable? "What kind of trip?" he asked carefully. "You'll see," Alex said with a grin. "But you'll need to pack. Just a few things. A couple of changes of clothes. Your toothbrush. We've got everything else covered." Jenny placed the towels on his bed and added, "Oh, and bring anything special you might want with you. Photos, maybe." That last remark landed like a stone in Antonio's stomach. Photos. The thought of taking Sophia's picture felt final, like closing a door he wasn't ready to let go of. But he nodded, not wanting to make a fuss. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll be ready." In the hours that followed, Antonio packed slowly, deliberately. He folded his shirts with care, tucking in the worn photograph of Sophia last, as if her presence would steady him. He placed his belongings into the old leather suitcase he hadn't used in years. The sound of the zipper closing felt like a chapter ending. When Alex and Jenny ushered him into the car, Antonio settled into the back seat, the suitcase resting on his lap. They drove in near silence at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Alex handled the wheel confidently, while Jenny occasionally glanced back with a reassuring smile. As they left the city, the landscape began to change. The towering buildings gave way to rolling hills, the grey of the urban streets fading into soft greens and golden yellows. Antonio watched the transition unfold, his gaze lingering on the open fields dotted with wildflowers and weathered barns. It was a familiar sight, one that tugged at the edges of his memory. Sophia would have loved this drive, he thought. She had always adored the countryside, especially in spring when the earth seemed to come alive. They had taken so many drives like this in their younger days, laughing at their silly dreams, their hands intertwined as they planned a future that seemed limitless. But now, Antonio sat alone in the back seat, his hands clutching the suitcase. The ache in his chest grew with each passing mile. He dared not ask where they were going. The answer felt too heavy to hear. Instead, he let the memories wash over him, finding comfort in their bittersweet embrace. The car slowed as they turned onto a narrow gravel road. Tall trees flanked the path, their leaves forming a canopy that dappled the sunlight. Antonio's pulse quickened. The scenery had shifted again, no longer open and inviting, but secluded and quiet. His grip on the suitcase tightened. The road to a remote nursing home, and he was prepared to face this. This was it. The car came to a stop at the end of the road, and Alex turned off the engine. "We're here," he said, his voice calm but unreadable. Antonio hesitated before opening the door. His legs felt heavy as he stepped out, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The air was fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. But his heart thudded in his chest as his gaze fell on the narrow path ahead, winding through the trees. It led to something just out of view, something unknown. Jenny came to his side, placing a hand on his arm. "Come on, Antonio," she said softly. "It's just up ahead." He nodded, swallowing hard. Each step forward felt like surrender. Antonio stepped out of the car slowly, his legs trembling under the weight of his thoughts. The long journey had been quiet, filled with his silent resignation to what he believed was his fate. His heart was heavy. His mind braced for the sight of a nursing home, a place he had convinced himself would be his new reality. But when he lifted his gaze, what he saw instead stopped him in his tracks. Before him stood his old house. The familiar structure he had thought lost forever now gleamed in the sunlight as though it had never been touched by the devastating fire. The crisp white paint glowed, the wooden porch railings sturdy and new, and the windows clear and inviting. Antonio blinked, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. He turned to Alex, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Alex stepped beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's your house, Papa," he said gently. "We rebuilt it." The words hung in the air, sinking slowly into Antonio's consciousness. His breath caught, and his chest tightened with emotion. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his shoes crunching on the gravel path. Every detail seemed untouched by time, yet impossibly new, as if someone had carefully reassembled the fragments of his past and breathed life into them once more. Jenny appeared at his side, her face alight with quiet pride. "We didn't do it alone," she said, her tone warm and steady. "The neighbors, the community, they all helped. Everyone wanted to see this house come back to life." Antonio's hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth railing of the porch. Memories flooded back with each step. Sophia's laugh as she stood at the door, welcoming visitors with a tray of freshly baked bread. The quiet evenings on the porch where he and his wife had shared stories under the Texas stars. For years he had believed those moments were gone, reduced to ashes along with the house. Yet here he was, standing before them, his past brought back to life in wood and paint. "Come inside, Papa," Alex said softly, his voice steady with emotion. "There's more to see." Antonio hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground before finally nodding. As Alex opened the door, the familiar creak of the hinges filled the air, and Antonio stepped through the threshold. His breath caught again. The house wasn't just rebuilt, it was alive with memory. The layout was the same as it had always been, down to the placement of the furniture. The polished wood floors gleamed under the sunlight streaming through the windows. The walls were painted in warm, comforting tones. And on the mantel above the fireplace sat a framed photograph of Sophia. She smiled out at him, radiant and full of life, just as he remembered. Antonio walked through the living room slowly, his fingers grazing the back of the old armchair he had spent countless evenings in. It had been reupholstered, but it was unmistakably the same chair, familiar in its structure and comfort. Each step felt like stepping back into a life he had thought he would never touch again. "Alex," he finally managed, turning to his son. "How? Why?" Alex smiled, a mixture of pride and relief in his expression. "We couldn't let this house disappear, Papa," he said. "It meant too much to you, to all of us. We wanted to give you back something that felt like home." Jenny stepped forward, holding a thick, worn album in her hands. She extended it to Antonio, her voice gentle. "We found this while going through what we could salvage after the fire," she said. "We thought you'd want it." Antonio's hands trembled as he took the album. It was old but intact, the edges slightly singed but holding together. He opened the cover to find photographs of his life with Sophia, their wedding day, the two of them laughing in the garden, Alex as a boy with Palomo in the background. The images were a timeline of love and resilience, a testament to the life they had built together. Tears welled in his eyes as he turned the pages. His fingers lingered on a photograph of Sophia, planting roses in the garden. He could almost hear her voice, teasing him about spending more time with Palomo than with her. "The papers you signed months ago," Alex said quietly, breaking the silence. "They weren't for selling the land, Papa. They were construction permits. We needed your approval to rebuild." Antonio looked up sharply, his tear-filled eyes locking with Alex's. He had thought those papers were a final farewell to the last piece of his old life. Instead, they had been the first step toward reclaiming it. "You did this for me?" Antonio asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded. "You gave us everything, Papa. This was the least we could do for you." Antonio clutched the album to his chest, his heart swelling with gratitude and something else, hope. For the first time in years, he felt a piece of himself return, a connection to the life he had thought was gone forever. Looking at Alex and Jenny, standing together in the house that had once been his refuge, he realized that home was not just a place. It was the love that had rebuilt it. Antonio stood in the doorway of his newly restored home, his hands gripping the smooth, freshly painted frame as he tried to steady his trembling legs. Inside the house, Jenny and Alex spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying a warmth that wrapped around Antonio like a familiar embrace. Yet his heart was caught in a storm, grateful overwhelmed and still struggling to believe this miracle was real. Then a sound broke through the haze of his thoughts. It was faint at first, a distant whinny carried on the breeze. Antonio froze, his body tensing as recognition sparked in his chest. The sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable in its familiarity. He turned sharply, his gaze sweeping across the yard until it landed on the edge of the garden. There, tied to a sturdy post near a row of newly planted flowers, stood Palomo. For a moment, Antonio couldn't move. His breath hitched as he took in the sight of his old companion. Palomo's coat gleamed in the sunlight, a little grayer than before, but no less regal. The horse lifted its head, ears twitching, and let out another soft whinny, as if calling to him. Antonio's knees nearly buckled as he stumbled forward, his hands reaching instinctively for the horse. "Palomo," he whispered, his voice breaking as he closed the distance between them. The horse stepped closer, nuzzling Antonio's shoulder with a familiarity that shattered the last of his composure. Antonio threw his arms around Palomo's neck, burying his face in the animal's mane as tears streamed freely down his weathered cheeks. "You're alive?" he choked out, his voice muffled. "I thought I'd lost you too." After a long moment, Alex stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "We found him, Papa," he said, his tone steady. "A few weeks after the fire. He was wandering near the outskirts of town." Antonio turned, his eyes still wet but shining with gratitude. "You found him?" he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Alex nodded. "The neighbors helped care for him until we could bring him here. We wanted him to be part of this, part of your homecoming." Jenny joined them, placing a reassuring hand on Antonio's arm. "It wasn't just us, Antonio," she said softly. "Everyone pitched in. They knew how much this would mean to you." Antonio's gaze shifted from Alex to Jenny, then back to Palomo. His mind raced to process their words, the layers of effort and thoughtfulness behind every detail of this day. He reached out, running his hand along Palomo's mane, feeling the solid, warm presence of the horse under his palm. It grounded him, anchoring him to the present moment. "I don't know what to say," Antonio finally murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. This is more than I could have ever dreamed." Alex stepped closer, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, Papa," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Just know this. You've never been a burden to us, not once. You've always been our foundation, our strength. This house, Palomo, all of it, it's just a small way of showing you how much we love you." Antonio swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He turned back to Palomo, his hands steadying as he stroked the horse's neck. For the first time in years, the ache in his chest began to ease, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Antonio looked at Alex and Jenny, his heart full. "You've given me back more than a house," he said quietly. "You've given me back my life." Alex stepped forward, his expression earnest. "No, Papa," he said. "You gave us life. This is just our way of saying thank you." And for the first time in years, Antonio allowed himself to believe it. Antonio Morales stood at the edge of his garden, a worn spade in his hand, surveying the patch of earth that had once been his pride. The soil was rich and dark, freshly tilled, and carried the familiar scent of renewal. The garden had been a place of solace in his younger years, a canvas for his labor and love. Now, with Alex and Jenny's help, it was coming back to life. "Try planting the roses here, Papa," Alex suggested, pointing to a sunny spot near the fence. Antonio nodded, kneeling carefully to press a small bush into the soil. His hands, though aged and calloused, moved with precision. Each motion felt deliberate, meaningful, as if he were not just planting flowers, but sowing hope into the ground. Jenny knelt beside him, holding a watering can. "These roses were Sophia's favorite, weren't they?" she asked softly, her tone warm. Antonio paused, a faint smile crossing his lips. Yes, she loved how they bloomed in the summer, filling the air with their scent. She used to say they made the house feel alive. His voice caught slightly, but he continued, "I think she'd like this." Aye. The three of them worked side by side until the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. By the time they finished, the garden was dotted with vibrant green shoots and young flowers. Antonio stood back, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose returning. As the days passed, neighbors began stopping by, drawn by the news of Antonio's return and the sight of the restored house. They brought homemade pies, baskets of fresh fruit, and warm embraces, filling the space with a lively buzz. Antonio, though overwhelmed at first, found himself welcoming the company. "You've always been a part of this community, Antonio," Giogra said, handing him a jar of honey. "We're just glad to have you back where you belong." Antonio looked around at the smiling faces, the cheerful conversations spilling across the porch. For years, he had felt forgotten, adrift in a life that no longer seemed to need him. But here, among these people, he realized he was still part of something bigger, a family, a neighborhood, a community. In the evenings, Alex often joined him on the porch, a steaming cup of tea in hand. They would sit in companionable silence at first, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Then, slowly, Alex would begin to talk. "Do you remember that summer when you taught me how to fix the fence?" Alex asked one evening, a hint of a smile on his face. "I thought it was the hardest thing in the world, and you made me redo it twice." Antonio chuckled, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "You need to learn patience. I didn't want you to grow up thinking shortcuts would get you anywhere." Alex nodded, his expression turning serious. "You taught me more than that, Papa. Everything I am, everything I've achieved, it's because of you. I don't say it enough, but thank you." Antonio reached over, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, Alex. Seeing the man you've become, the family you've built, that's all the thanks I need." The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Jenny, too, found ways to deepen their connection, often sitting with Antonio to share stories or brainstorm new ideas for the garden. One afternoon, as they admired the blooming flowers, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "We should have a little celebration," she said, "to mark this new beginning, a homecoming, if you will." Antonio hesitated. "A party? Isn't that too much trouble?" "Not at all," Jenny insisted. "It's a way to bring everyone together and celebrate what we've rebuilt." Despite his initial reluctance, Antonio agreed. The idea of gathering everyone, family, friends, neighbors, felt right. It was a way to honor not just the home, but the love that had made it whole again. The evening of the party arrived, bringing with it a sense of warmth and joy that filled every corner of the house. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting a soft glow over the garden, now in full bloom. The air was alive with laughter and music, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation. Antonio stood near the porch, a glass of lemonade in hand, taking it all in. For the first time since Sophia's passing, he felt truly present, no longer weighed down by loss or guilt. Instead, he was surrounded by life, by the people who loved him, by the home he had thought he'd lost, and by the garden that now symbolized a fresh start. As the evening wore on, Alex raised a toast, his voice steady but full of emotion. "To Papa," he said, lifting his glass, "to the man who taught us what it means to love, to work hard, and to never give up. Welcome home." The crowd echoed the sentiment, raising their glasses in unison. Antonio, though not one for grand displays, felt a tear slide down his cheek. He raised his own glass, nodding in gratitude. At that moment he realized he was not just returning to a house or a garden. He was returning to life, and for the first time in years, it felt like home. Antonio sat on the wide wooden porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun dipped low, casting hues of orange and purple across the sky. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of wildflowers from the nearby garden. His fingers, worn yet steady, turned the pages of an old journal. It was Sophia's, a treasure Alex had unearthed during the restoration of the house. The words within were as familiar as the sound of her laughter had once been. Sophia had written about the little things, the way the morning light fell across their bedroom, the joy of planting new seeds in the spring garden, and the love they shared over decades of quiet, steady companionship. Her voice, captured in ink, filled the silence around him, and for the first time in years, Antonio felt her presence as if she were sitting beside him. "She always saw the beauty in everything," Antonio murmured, his voice low. He rested his hand on the journal, letting its weight ground him in the moment. The sun had almost set, and the sky burned with the last golden rays. It was a sight Sophia would have paused to admire, perhaps nudging him gently to notice the wonder of it. The house behind him was alive with sounds of family. Alex's deep laugh echoed faintly as he helped Jenny prepare dinner. The comforting clatter of plates and cutlery mingled with the muffled chatter of voices. It was a far cry from the stillness Antonio had grown used to in his years of loneliness, a reminder that he was no longer alone. Setting the journal aside, Antonio reached for the envelope on the small table next to him. He had written the letter days ago, in the stillness of an early morning. It wasn't meant for anyone but himself, a quiet acknowledgement of the thoughts that had haunted him for so long. He unfolded it carefully and began to read. "I doubted myself," the letter began, the words stark yet honest. "I thought I was a burden, a shadow in the lives of those I love. But I was wrong. My family has shown me that love doesn't see burdens. It sees only the joy of giving, the strength of bonds that hold us together. They've given me more than I deserve, more than I ever thought possible." Antonio paused, his eyes lingering on the words. He had poured years of guilt, doubt, and sorrow into this letter, but writing it had brought him something unexpected: clarity. He had spent so much time believing he was an anchor weighing his family down, never realizing he was, in fact, their foundation. "I'm grateful," the letter continued, "for the love Sophia gave me, for the home we built together, and for the son who has carried that love forward. I'm grateful for this second chance to live, to feel, to belong. I won't waste it." Antonio folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. He didn't need to read it again. The words were etched into his heart now, a quiet promise to himself to embrace the life he had been given. A soft whinny drew his attention, and he turned to see Palomo grazing nearby. The horse had become his steadfast companion once more, a reminder of the resilience that had carried them both through the hardest times. Antonio rose from the porch and walked to the garden. his steps slow but sure. He reached out to stroke Palomo's mane, the horse leaning into his touch with a familiarity that spoke of years of trust. "We've come a long way, haven't we, old friend?" Antonio said softly. Palomo snorted in response, as if agreeing. The garden, now lush and vibrant, was a testament to Antonio's renewed purpose. Rows of vegetables thrived under his care, their growth mirroring the quiet healing within him. Each plant was a small victory, a sign that life, no matter how fragile, could begin anew. As the last light faded, Alex stepped onto the porch. "Dinner's ready, Papa," he called, his voice warm and inviting. Antonio turned, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'll be right there," he replied, giving Palomo a final pat before heading inside. The dining room was filled with warmth. The table, set simply but thoughtfully, was surrounded by the people who mattered most. Antonio took his seat, glancing at Alex and Jenny as they settled beside him. The meal was humble, roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, but it was served with a richness that came from shared effort and love. As the conversation flowed, Antonio found himself laughing, his voice blending with theirs in a harmony he hadn't known he missed. He looked around the table, at the faces of his family, and felt a deep, unshakable peace. This was home, not just the house, but the people within it. For the first time in years, Antonio felt whole. The wounds of the past, though not forgotten, had softened, leaving room for something new. Gratitude, joy, belonging. As the evening wore on and the house grew quiet once more, Antonio stood at the window, watching the stars. He whispered a silent thanks to Sophia, to Alex, and to life itself for bringing him back to this moment. The past had been hard, but the future, he realized, was still his to embrace. And, in that stillness, surrounded by love, Antonio knew he had truly come home. And that, my friends, is the story of Antonio, a journey of love, resilience, and the power of family. It's a reminder that no matter how lost we may feel, love has a way of bringing us back home. What did you think about Alex's efforts to rebuild not just a house, but his father's spirit? Would you have done the same, or handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring tales of love, family, and redemption. And as always, thank you for being part of this journey with me. Until next time, take care, and remember, sometimes the smallest acts of love leave the biggest impact.